3, tell the truth. Tell the truth. You don't want to be brutally honest and therefore just cast other people's emotions or feelings aside, but on the other hand, you never want to be dishonest. Never want to be dishonest. Tell the truth. He looked at my son, that doctor did. He looked at my son and said, Joe, this is going to what? Hurt. Now, if he would have said to my son, Joe, this won't hurt a bit, at that moment in time, there's no reason that Joe would have not believed that. He'd never had stitches before, never had shots in his chin. You know, I'll assume that Joe would have believed him if he said it wouldn't have hurt. But at the very instant, at the very moment that needle pierced flesh, at the moment that those nerve endings came alive and shipped that message to the brain, that's pain. At that moment, Joe is saying to himself, he, what? Lied, and therefore whatever else he has told me, I can no longer believe. Our integrity, our credibility, our believability is too important for us to risk that. Tell the truth, even when the truth is not going to be too palatable. We're all adults. We may not want to hear it, but we need to hear it for our own edification, our own justification, our own good purposes. Number 1, talk with others. Number 2, explain the process. Start the conversation by explaining what needs to be done or what will be done. Let me tell you something I've learned after 30 years plus in my own professional career. There's always a process and it will always eventually get explained. The problem is for those who try to go too quickly, who get in too much of a hurry, who try to jump over 1 or 2 or 3 steps in the process, they end up having to explain the process after the damage has been done or after the emotion has already grown to a fever pitch, and therefore people don't want to hear it. The question that people always want to know from the most effective communicators is, why didn't you tell me earlier? Well, that's the process. Explain the process. Tell them what to expect. The doctor took great pains to tell my son what it was going to be like to get stitches. Now, granted, the doctor had probably given hundreds, if not thousands, of stitches to other patients prior, but this boy had never had one. Explain the process. I grew up in a little rural area in western Kentucky. Any Kentuckians in the room? I met somebody in the hallway yesterday. There she is. I met her yesterday. There's a couple over here. Well, some of you may have grown up in rural environments, rural situation. And in my little town in Kentucky, Farmersville, Kentucky, if that tells you anything, my grandmother was the consummate country grandmother. My grandmother, for example, I never saw her in anything but a dress or a skirt in her entire life. I never saw her in pants. I never saw her in shorts. Certainly never saw her in a bathing suit. My grandmother lived out in the country. She did not have running water for her entire life. And she died in April of 1974. When she had to go to the restroom, she had to start early because she had to start down the path and go behind the hen house and the smokehouse out to the outhouse. My grandmother cooked on a wood stove till the day she died. And it was the food I can still remember. It was wonderful. My grandmother always wore an apron. Always wore an apron. And always had two pockets in her apron. One pocket always had a handkerchief. My grandmother told me, you can conquer the world with a handkerchief, Phil. And she always had one. And in the other pocket, she always had, she had a can of snuff. My grandmother liked to dip a little snuff. Now, let me tell you something. That was my grandmother. That's how I remember my grandmother. But the thing I remember most about my grandmother is how much she loved her grandkids. I remember one particular occasion, I was at her house and she was making homemade biscuits from scratch. It was a process that took 30, 45 minutes, I don't know, a long time. And it was perfect because it gave us time together. And I can remember her working in that kitchen. I can remember the flour on her apron. I can remember her moving around, not so quickly because she was getting a little bit older at that time. But I remember following her, and everywhere she went, I would just talk. She didn't say 5 words in 30 minutes. And that was perfect as far as I was concerned because all I wanted her to do was listen to me. And I continued to talk as any little 5-year-old talkative boy will do until finally I remember my grandmother turning around, wiping her hands on her apron and leaning forward and saying, "Son, come here, come here." Well, I didn't know what she wanted, but I knew I was about to get what I wanted, which was her full attention. "Son, come here," she said. I walked over to her. I'm looking up. I'm probably about 5, maybe 6 years old at the time. And I remember she took her old gnarled fingers and put them on my shoulders and looked down. Now, I don't know how recently you've been around an older folks, but oftentimes they need someone to brace on. You know? And when I had her take a hold of my shoulders, even as a young boy, I remember thinking, well, she needs to brace. But then the next thing I realized was there was pressure on my shoulders, and she was getting down. And she was holding me to brace, but not for the reason I wanted. And eventually, she ended up in this position right here. Now, it was the first time in my young life that my grandmother and I had ever been what? Eye to eye. On the same level, if you were. Now, I didn't understand this at the time. I didn't know what was happening, but I liked it. I liked it. I can even remember as a young boy thinking, this is special. Pay close attention. This may not happen again. And as my grandmother's holding my shoulders, as she's looking deep into my eyes and as I'm returning that gaze, she said something to me some 50 plus years ago that I have never forgotten that I'm about to share with you now. She looked in my eyes and she said, "Shut up!" I wasn't expecting that. And quite frankly, I tried to recoil. I tried to run from her, and her grip tightened. And she actually drew me to her breast. And when she did, she wrapped her arms around me. And you can believe this or not, but I'm telling you the truth. Even this morning, I can still feel the compression in my mind's eye of that day. And when she had me totally immobilized, she whispered these words in my ear. "Son, don't you realize that when you're talking, you never learn anything? It's only when you're willing to shut up and listen that you might just learn something." Folks, as I said, that's been 50 plus years ago. And it's as true today as it was then. If we're willing to shut up and listen, even when the times are the most critical, even when things are happening that we could not have anticipated and that others want immediate answers to, if we can listen, we can learn. On the other hand, we must first learn to listen before we can learn.